morning, everybody. Good morning. We're going to have a very intimate session today. This is about Eurostars. My name is Edwin Forrest, and I'm honored to be moderating this panel of Eurostars. I'm the co-founder and CEO of StudyPortals. This session is going to be about why Europe is not the forgotten continent, even though the attendance at this session might indicate it. So you came to the right place. Well, why is Europe not the forgotten continent? Europe has 700 million people, and according to the World Bank, it is the highest continent in GDP. I couldn't find any data on the size of the middle class, but I think it's safe to assume that the GDP is uniquely equally distributed in Europe compared to other continents. So a great market for education. According to Bright Eye, the EdTech investments in Europe tripled from 2014 to 2017. And there's an expected 10% annual growth in EdTech business for the next 5 years in Europe. So I'd like to just start off with a little round of the panel, asking if you can say who you are, where you are from, and where you are based. And also what you think is the most interesting distinguishing factor of Europe. Lucy.
Hi, I'm Lucy Stonehill. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Buzu. We are a leading provider of university and careers guidance software to secondary schools. We have secondary schools in 64 countries now, and I split my time between our bases in London and Hong Kong. I think probably, from my perspective, the biggest distinguishing factor in building an education technology business in Europe is that you are sort of forced to think globally from day one. And so some of the challenges around diversifying your product, your team, and your offering to prepare for scale, I think are baked into the DNA of European founders a lot more so than our US counterparts.
Thanks, Bernhard.
Hi everyone, my name is Bernhard Niesnner. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Buzu. We're the world's largest social network for language learning. So we provide language courses in 12 different languages, and then you have the ability to practice your skills with the native speakers of our community. We started a business 10 years ago, so to a certain extent we're a bit of the grandpa of the EdTech industry of Europe, as at that time there was actually nothing like EdTech in Europe. And we've scaled the company now to over 80 million customers in over 190 different countries. What makes Europe different, I would add to the global aspect and global aspiration of the European founders, is that in Europe, simply we don't raise as much money as in the US. And that also trains us to be highly capital efficient with the money. And the third aspect, I think, which is related to the second, I see a lot of US founders who seem to be very keen on making big dollars as part of their EdTech journey, whereas in Europe, it seems there's much more passion around actually what we are doing in EdTech in terms of impacting global people around the world.
Anders.
Hello, I'm Anders. I'm co-founder and CEO of Aula. I'm originally from Denmark, but we started at Oxford, based in London, so a very sort of European team. We're building a communication platform that replaces learning management systems and emails, and we're working with some of the top universities in the UK for now to help them increase student engagement. In terms of what I think is the most interesting sort of distinguishing factor in Europe, not just in terms of EdTech, but in tech in general, I think you get definitely more value for money in terms of talent. We've recently recruited quite a few people, not just from Europe, but also from other continents. And I think it's quite clear that especially in the London area, you can get access to some amazing people without having to pay the Silicon Valley price tag. And I think that just makes it easier similar to what Bernhard is saying, to actually do something that's more capital efficient, where you can reach larger scale without having to raise the same amounts that you need to do in the US to reach the same scale.
Thank you. And Michal.
My name is Michal Borkowski. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Brainly. Originally from Poland, right now based in New York City. Brainy is a social learning platform for middle and high school students. The reason they come to Brainy is that they need help with their homework or test preparation, basically any education question that they may have. Right now we are used by more than 100 million monthly users every month. And we are pretty much we have a global presence, starting from like Philippines in the east through Indonesia, India, some countries in Europe, Russia, through the Americas and the US, Latin America and Brazil. And I think like Europe is a great place to start like EdTech company because in fact it's a very diverse place. Like every country is quite consistent, but the close proximity of countries and the fact that there are these centers like Berlin, right now Barcelona, and like historically London, this in fact gets people to understand that there are other cultures. And together with other cultures, there are different educational models. In fact, the educational system in Poland versus the UK or Germany is a very different one, but because we are so close to each other and part of the European Union still, like the exchange of knowledge is fairly easy.
Hey, Michal, you are in the K-12 space mostly, right?
Yeah.
So what do you see trends happening in Europe, things that are different than what you're seeing here in the US? What do you think from a non-European perspective, what's interesting to watch in Europe?
I think that the quality of education that is provided in Europe, that is provided like from public money, is way higher than in any place in the world. Like what we see from our perspective of presence in Indonesia and India, parents don't really expect the government to provide like super great quality education. They understand it's on them to give like opportunities to their kids to take some additional lessons, to provide them with additional materials or tutoring to like excel in their educational process. In Europe, that's like educational systems are pretty like well developed, like relatively well funded. And I also think the level of education between schools in Europe is not as polarized as in many other countries in the world, including the US.
That's an interesting point around public versus private funding of education. We'll get back to that later in the panel. So some trends for the K-12 space. In higher ed, in particular, I think if you look at continental Europe, there's a lot of changes. At least what we can see in our data is that Europe offered about 500 English degree programs in 2002 and now has 10,000 degree programs. I think we've sent 120,000 enrollments to study in continental Europe to study in English, which was not possible 15 years back. Lucy, you are in higher ed. Do you think continental Europe can become a competitive force against the US, the UK, the Australia in terms of attracting global talent?
I mean, I think it has to, right? I mean, one of the things that is very interesting when you're sort of, I mean, we service the secondary school side, but we see all the patterns of changing mobility and the changing interests and tides with the emerging kind of effectively global middle class student population. And students, in effect, have more choice now. There are, very interesting and very, very impressive universities and programs popping up closer to home for Asian students, right? So, the likes of, Tsinghua, HKU, these incredible emerging institutions. So I think, no longer, I think we're already seeing this in the data, but no longer is it the case that students who are kind of globally mobile in their intentions for study abroad are just thinking about the US and the UK. That's a big opportunity for Asia, the Middle East, and continental Europe, which traditionally have not been, the most popular destinations. But I think they're going to need to really innovate and offer programs in different languages to appeal to a wider demographic.
Great, Bernhard, how do you feel about this whole language dimension? Because that's your field, right? So what, is everything going to merge to English in Europe? Is it?
No, I don't think so. But obviously, I mean, English is the lingua franca of the world. And that is also a huge benefit because in Europe in general, people learn when they're very young, different languages. I speak 4 languages myself, and it's totally natural already at very early stage to acquire English and potentially another second language, which is a huge benefit to the US, where obviously most of the people just speak English. And therefore, I think automatically in Europe you have a much more cultural, diverse, and open mindset.
Great. Hey, Anders, what do you think? What is the trends that you see in higher ed? Because I think that's your space.
Yeah, I think one thing so this is a massive generalization, but I think there's sort of 2 interesting areas where when you compare the US and when you compare Europe, where there's sort of quite a big difference. One is around the focus on the pedagogical models, and the other one is around focus on business models. So I think a lot of the EdTech startups we see coming out of Europe that work directly with teachers are much more focused on actually doing things that relate to student engagement, whereas in the US, quite often what we see are things that are more related to grading, to analytics, to things that support administrators. And as I said, like it's a bit of a generalization, but a lot of the very successful European EdTech startups relate directly to the student experience. So that's one difference. I think another one is around business models, where I think generally there's a bit more, both for good and for bad, I guess, in the US, there's a bit more acceptance of being creative with the business model, which I think can sometimes have a bit of a backlash in education, where you build sort of a massive user base and then you find ways to monetize it later, which is not always the best way to go about it, at least in institutionalized education. So for example, I can see that a lot of our clients, some of the products that are coming from the US have like 0 appeal, because they don't really know how the companies are going to make money, whereas I think a lot of the European EdTech startups, by the way that they operate, think that into the flows, into how they think about their business to actually have paying clients quite early on.
Yeah.
I guess that's sort of also true for some of the other sort of business models that are here as well.
And do you notice that, because Michal was saying, I think very rightly, that it's predominantly public funded education in Europe, particularly for the European residents. And some people might say, well, if the universities just get the state funding, they don't really have to compete for the students. It's going to make them a little slower, or maybe a little bit less innovative, would take maybe more bureaucratic. I think you sell straight into institutions, right?
We sell to universities, yeah.
Obviously, for you, that's very easy because you have such a successful product. But how do you see other companies struggling with that?
Well, I think in general, like there are definitely, I mean, we feel that as well. Like there are procurement problems in higher education, not just in Europe, but across the world. And I think, I mean, there are advantages to having sort of publicly funded institutions in general. I think, I mean, I'm from Denmark, where education is free from you're born until you die. So that's very different from in the US. In terms of, from a company perspective, selling into institutions, it really depends on the country. I definitely do think that for the countries where there's a large degree of public funding, there are generally like fewer competitive pressures on the universities to move fast. So I do think that we see in the US that a lot of, and in Asia in particular as well, I think a lot of the universities have incentives to move a lot faster than they have in some European countries.
But I would like to add to that, I see this as a massive opportunity. So for example, I'm an advisor to the Austrian government with regards to education innovation, and they recently announced a 50 million euro innovation fund, which was a big boom in Austria that they're actually spending, which obviously is peanuts for the Austrian government, but it was a big project. And they're just starting to really think about how to include EdTech in the entire education system, whereas here, and you see it at the conference, it's just a day-to-day. And it takes now forever to sell EdTech innovation into an Austrian university or school, because they simply don't have the budget. Some, that don't even have a solid internet connection. A lot of parents are questioning whether, there should be technology at all in the classroom. So basically, we are probably 30 years behind the US, but that's a huge opportunity because it's gonna change. And, parents want the kids to use technology and to learn more recent subjects that can be used later on. And therefore, once Europe will make this change, it will be a huge opportunity for EdTech.
Do you think it will be on time?
We have to be on time, because otherwise we do indeed turn into this museum where people just come to visit because it's nice and warm and have good food. I mean, we have no other chance in Europe to turn it around. And I think the government, the EU is slowly waking up. China obviously has massively overtaken in terms of dynamics and is already raising more EdTech money than the US. So there is no other choice than waking up in Europe.
Where do you guys see Europe to be in 10 years from now? What would be Europe's position in the global marketplace, and in particular in relation to education, but also the global flow of talent?
I mean, I think it's interesting what Bernhard was saying. I mean, I think one of the, as he says, challenges of Europe is that, well, frankly, it's a challenge, but then it could be a massive opportunity, as you mentioned, Edwin. 700-800 million people. That is 2.5 times the size of the United States. So if you're able to think as a single market, I say that ironically, as the United Kingdom is on the panel here.
Were we allowed to say the B word?
We're going to leave that one.
We're going to bring up the B word pretty soon.
But I think
hold on tight.
But Edwin, you're Dutch. You were speaking about Denmark, Poland, Austria, United Kingdom. One of the challenges is we are also, and I think we think less this way than our peers who live and still operate in those countries, is if you're just focused on the Austrian education system, if you're just focused on the Finnish education system, the Danish, these are genuinely tiny markets, right? And so the genuine barrier to scale is really real. However, if the European Union is able to build, and I know that there are intentions, there are initiatives like Horizon 2020 where they are intending to build more unity across education systems, curricula, mobility across the continent. And I think if we are able to kind of progress through those hurdles of not being 27, states effectively, but actually able to operate more as one unit, then there's immense power and potential there. And I actually think that's the only way to kind of compete with a country like China.
Yeah, and I have a slightly different view on that, because I think that the beauty of Europe as a market is that diversity. And I think like there is unification needed in many areas, like rules of making business, like making sure that taxation works similarly and there are no like loopholes to avoid paying taxes. But I think the strength of Europe in long term should come from the diversity. There is nothing wrong about having different educational systems, as long as these educational systems speak to each other
right.
and learn from each other when it comes to how do you make students more prepared to the challenges of the new employment market. And from that perspective, I think that I agree with Bernhard. I think there are two scenarios. Like one is that Europe is going to develop into that direction where it embraces diversity and it tries to learn from it rather than to kill diversity and try to make everyone in the same way. And from that perspective, it's like a huge market that has its own obstacles, like number of languages, like to maintain. It's a very important challenge from a company perspective. That said, it's nothing that is impossible to do. Like Facebook operates in so many countries with so many different languages, so it's totally possible. But I think the other like scenario that is not positive is that like museum thing. That's like Europe is going to be that like old continent, not the oldest. Like I think China is oldest than Europe, but like it will be that old continent with a lot of pride about like starting a lot of things. But with less and less importance in the global market. And I really think there is that big question going on, specifically within the European Union, that should share some values, like what are the next steps? And I think that political risk is also influencing companies that operate within Europe.
And in this direction, I think an interesting topic is the whole discussion around privacy at the moment. And Europe is trying to take quite a strong stance and implementing GDPR. Do you feel this is going to help Europe in the sense that this will be a place where people will feel more safe and their privacy more respected? Or do you more think that these regulations are going to slow down innovation and is going to make it even more difficult for us to compete?
I mean, it's definitely not joyful to comply with GDPR, I have to say. I mean, it is a pain. But then again, I think it's absolutely required, and the Facebook scandal has shown that people are very concerned about their privacy, and Mark Zuckerberg himself mentioned that they now would like to comply with GDPR on a global level, so Europe, to a certain extent, is actually setting the standard for privacy. So I think it's a good thing. The problem I see in the education space that a lot of parents are still very much concerned about the ability to measure what is happening in schools and to predict learning outcomes. Where again, for example, in China, people are obsessed about measuring their kids and predicting how much they have progressed already in their learning. So I think we need a bit more of an open view on how much education technology can actually help learning outcomes rather than just fearing it.
Any other perspectives on this point around?
I think the regulation around privacy is really needed, but there is a huge risk that I think governments need to address, is that any regulation on privacy makes it easier for big companies to be compliant. So my view on GDPR is that like from business perspective, it creates a barrier for new companies to enter the market. But in general, I think it's really bad. It's bad for any company that operates on the market because it slows down innovation. So the question is how the regulation should evolve and what is going to be the regulation in the US and other markets globally to make sure that this doesn't stop competition from happening.
Many of you have grown a business in Europe, but have also grown a business in other continents. From the perspective of an EdTech entrepreneur, or either European or an American one, or wherever, from which continent, where do you see differences in terms of growing a business in Europe versus growing a business in other continents? What are the differences and what are the shortcuts to get you there the fastest?
I operate very heavily in Asia. So, probably by end of next year, half our revenues will come from Asia. And I think it's like delightful place to be building an EdTech company. I think, one of the challenges I think we find certainly in the UK and perhaps in the US as well, is that you have a lot of legacy structure and infrastructure that's already been built. And especially, on the university side, we have schools in the United Kingdom that are, 600, 700 years old. And oftentimes, I think there is a reluctance to change, to evolve, to think forward, to think ahead. Whereas, my experience of operating in Asia is that's just much more baked into DNA. Things are moving. They have been moving very quickly for a very long time. So people are used to a pace of change and evolution and a way of looking forward as a way to evolve, which I think lends itself very well to EdTech innovations and adoption.
So for which entrepreneurs in the room here would you advocate they should first go for Europe before they go to Asia?
I think Asia is a much less developed market from an EdTech perspective. So, we have an investor that is Asia-based, and they specifically invest in education technology solutions, and they are constantly bringing European and American innovations to Asia because they find that the concept of validation is oftentimes quite developed, and so there's an obvious opportunity to kind of take that foundation, that team, and apply it within these markets where there's ample opportunity. I think what I came back to at the beginning was that in Europe, you've sort of, if you're building an EdTech business, or frankly a technology-enabled service generally, I think you're thinking globally from day one. So that means that a leap further east is probably an easier step than if you have, homegrown a solution just in the United States, and that's become, that's your world in effect.
Anders, did you have comments on this, or?
No, I think for someone who's coming to Europe, I think the one thing I put down is to make sure to spend enough time choosing the first country well. Because I think one thing that was mentioned here is like the governance structures, at least within institutionalized education, vary quite a lot across countries. So there are some big markets, like for example, the UK is a sort of a decent market size, but it's also very different in terms of governance structures compared to other countries in continental Europe. So I think that's one thing to definitely think about. I think one advantage of going into any European country is that the ecosystems are smaller, so you can use that to faster reach a tipping point in terms of getting to know the people who are the relevant influencers in those markets. So for example, we are operating mainly with UK universities, and there are 140 of them. So it's, all the vice chancellors, the sort of university presidents, they all know each other pretty much, right? So that can definitely be an advantage in terms of getting traction in markets that have historically been relatively conservative, because then they start talking to their friends and stuff, whereas some of the Asian countries and the US are like massive markets to go into in terms of building a network amongst decision makers. But I think that's a bit different in B2C, but definitely in B2B it can be an advantage.
maybe on that a bit of our stories. I'm originally from Austria, and then I did an MBA in Madrid in Spain and came up with this idea of Buzu. And somehow we founded the company in Spain initially because we liked the weather and the food and the whole atmosphere. We just stayed there. But then after a few years, it became extremely complicated to scale the business, especially as the financial crisis was hitting Spain very hard. So the talent escaped, and we were there with a high-growth company and could not find a decent iOS developer who ideally spoke English as well and was willing to work for us. So we moved the entire business over to the UK, which was a big project. We had at that time 10 employees, 200 moving boxes, so we moved the entire business. And to be honest, at that time we were also looking at the US. And I went to Silicon Valley and I went to New York. And we simply, did our scoring and came up that still the UK, obviously before the B word was invented, was the best place to have a European EdTech business. And to a certain extent, we're very happy.
What was the deciding factor for you to say, I'm going to the pre-B UK?
I mean, number one, there is actually an exit tax if you move out a European business to the US. So therefore, there was a bit of tax and legal implications that is not that simple. And number two, we felt very strongly about that, we should be able to build a global business within Europe. And we didn't want to go necessarily to the US or to other markets. And given the fact that we have clients all over the world, it's to a certain extent the middle of the world, depending on your perspective, where it's close to Asia and close to the US. Yeah. And also, we need people with a lot of language skills. And I mean, London is one of the most cosmopolitan cities you can find. And if you need a Turkish speaker or a Brazilian Portuguese speaker, you will find them there. And that wasn't the case in Silicon Valley or in New York necessarily.
And we spoke a lot about America and about Asia, but I think almost all of the young population growth for the next 50 years is going to be in Africa. And that's our time zone. Unfortunately, not much affordability yet, but we have two entrepreneurs here at least that I guess have a very scalable solution. Do you see European entrepreneurs well positioned to take opportunities in Africa?
In my perspective, we are the same position as any other company. Like, time zone helps, but I wouldn't say that's the decisive point in achieving success in a market. I think like Africa is a very interesting market. In fact, we are present in South Africa. That said, it's like super early, and Asia is like developing super fast right now, and I think many innovations in educational technology come from Asia, and like I personally learned so much from companies like from Byju's in India, from many companies in China on what they do when it comes to educational technology. That it's like super interesting to implement. Africa, I think, is still super early when it comes to the development. It may be even a bit too early, and the question is like what is the value that you're trying to get from that market, and what value you are trying to offer in exchange.
I think there's also a logistical challenge. I mean, we are B2B in that we license our software solution to secondary schools, but across a very wide variety of geographies, so 64 countries. The majority of our users are in our customers, our students, our teachers are in emerging markets, and even in some of the more developed emerging markets, that we still constantly are dealing with blackouts, bandwidth issues. We actually have in the United Kingdom, we had a school last week that had its internet down for 3 days. So I think, and that's in the UK. It probably says something about the bandwidth in the UK, but I think there are also sort of genuine infrastructure challenges that I think still do prohibit some markets from participating in the EdTech kind of revolution, and that certainly won't always be the case. Obviously there's a number of projects specifically focused on bringing connectivity to those who are not connected, which I think will do amazing things for enabling those populations to participate in some of these opportunities. But I think our experience is that is genuinely still quite an issue, even if you're servicing kind of relatively premium schools that we do, if they happen to be in markets where there's not always a stable connection.
Great. So for a non-European EdTech founder today, has to choose a city. Which city do you guys recommend and why?
There's really only one choice, let's be honest. I mean,
Vienna. Right?
Madrid?
Bucharest. I mean, I think, you know, we can at some point talk about the B word.
How does it
but
affect the attractiveness of London as a landing?
I mean, London is unrivaled in diversity of talent in capital. So I mean, I think there are different options. I mean, people always like to go back and forth between London and Berlin. And actually, if you look at the numbers, you look at the sheer scale of people, of companies, especially of scaled companies that are scaling, you can't hold a candle to London. Now, that will change. I mean, to what degree that'll change, I think remains to be seen. But, you know, I know so many founders have moved from continental Europe to London specifically because they can't raise the type of financing that they need to continue their businesses, let alone scale them, you know, not being co-located in a place like London or Berlin.
I think it will depend. I mean, Rome was unrivaled in the 1st century as the center place of the world. Look where Rome is now. So history will tell, actually, where London can go. And it might go much quicker than what we think. So I think there is a huge problem. It does impact us because it has now become close to impossible to recruit Europeans to come to London. Because if you're now a 25-year-old mobile developer in Madrid where the sun is shining, why would you go to London? Your legal situation is not yet totally clear. The pound is 20% down, so you're not earning as much as you used to, and it's raining all the time. So, you know, your incentive to go there has simply reduced. Same with the team. We have 50% Europeans, non-Brits in our team, and at a certain point they will think and reconsider their options to potentially go back. So it is impacting massively. The European Union is a big LP in many venture capitalists in the UK, and I'm not sure they're very happy to continue to be so. So I think that future will tell. It is still a great city. I'm still glad to be based there. I still have a slight hope that Brexit will not happen, but you know, it could massively impact EdTech industry.
Bernhard, outside of London and Vienna, what do you think is the runner-up in continental Europe?
I think Spain is developing extremely well. They've learned a lesson from the crisis. I mean, I think at my time, it was an absolute nightmare from a bureaucratic perspective. It took us as long to found the business in the UK as it took us to change our address of the office. I mean, it's insane. You had to go to a notary for everything that we're doing in Spain. So there's a lot of improvements, I think, that are coming. And simply, Spain is a great country. And a lot of Spanish entrepreneurs, you know, engineers who went abroad now are coming back. And it's still much cheaper than the UK as well.
Any other cities?
I would say London as well, but we've actually done things a bit differently, which is partly because we're based in Europe, so we run a distributed team, so we are a smaller team compared to most of the other companies here, but all our engineers are based across the world, so we have people in 7 different countries who work from home or from co-working spaces. We use our own product as our digital office. We are based in London, but we employ 1 British person. So we tried, when we set out to create the company, to create a sort of, it's a bit of a buzzword, the sort of born global idea. But I think it works really well for us. We get it's much easier to recruit technical talent. And I would say, I mean, being based in Europe was one of the reasons we decided to do that. But now where we're sort of going into it, London's a bit more of we're based there, but we could move relatively fast from London. And I think it's just a different way to think about how you operate your business.
And do you see Brexit in any way affecting your operation of the business in London?
It affects our clients because Brexit will definitely affect universities. To be honest, I mean, I'm not too fearful. I don't think Brexit is a great thing, but I mean, the way we run the business it's very asset light. I think we could move to New York in less than 24 hours. We just canceled the WeWork license, and our engineers are still on Skype. So it's. Yeah.
From my perspective, it's possible to build business from any city in Europe. You have Spotify in Stockholm, and that's pretty much their main office. You have UiPath in Romania. And I think that notion of here, everybody needs to be in one town, walking distance from investors, it's no longer the case. I think the more, people start to understand more and more that there are like really good entrepreneurs all around the world, and there is an execution question. Obviously, there is question of can you attract talent. That said, I've never felt like this is the main barrier to build the business, and like over the time, I even see that barrier being like less and less prominent.
Why have you then moved to New
investors.
York, if I may ask?
I think we moved to New York to really understand the US market. And it was mainly about entering the US market from the perspective of really being here and like not underestimating how difficult the market is. And I think our presence in the US helped us to really build that playbook and understand our model. And what we've understood is that like every student in the world needs help in learning, and we want to be there to help them. So no matter what is the educational system, we have the product that addresses that need. And in fact, like the US is so diverse from like K through 12 education perspective, that's being able to look at our data development in specific school districts, even to the level of like a town and a school that like behavior is slightly different. It helped us to like map the global like curriculum map and understand how to develop everywhere else. But I also think like we moved to New York 3 years ago, and I feel like so much changed during that 3 years. Like there are so many companies being built like super successful in Brazil, India. Like majority of EdTech investments happens in Asia. It's nobody tells like companies from India to, oh, you should move to Silicon Valley if you want to enter the US. Nobody tells the Chinese companies you should move your operations to the US if you want to do something in the US or other markets. Yeah, there's that optionality that is on the table right now.
Lucy, you started off saying that in Europe you kind of start already with an international outlook, right? And you have to be international from day one, I think you mentioned. I wonder if any of you, I mean, it could also be said it's a nice way of saying your home market's really small.
Yeah.
Right? Is there anybody of you that is seeing that the fact that you start with this international, multi-language, perhaps multi-country approach really early on is really helping you to compete with companies who are from big home markets and perhaps don't have that in their DNA?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can absolutely become a competitive advantage, to be honest. I mean, if I think about everyone who operates in our sector, we are actually the only company that doesn't have 90% of our business in one country. And it's baked into the positioning around our service is actually we've been global from day one. And so if you're serving and you're servicing a global student and parent base, to say, oh, you know, we also can work with you, but you're you know, to imply that you're not influenced by the fact that 95% of your schools are in the UK, you're obviously going to build your product out first and foremost for that home market. So I think for us, it actually has become a major strength in distinguishing us from sort of either emerging competition or sort of, I guess, opportunistic competition from domestic markets where they suddenly wake up and say, oh, there's something to be said for operating internationally. And I think it's also so much easier, and what we've seen with some, bigger players in our space is that I think it's probably a lot harder once you are at a certain size and scale to then adapt the entire philosophy, the product, the approach, the infrastructure to be global. So if you have that approach from day one, you can kind of build with that infrastructure in mind as well.
I would totally agree. We get payments on a monthly basis from over 120 countries. And to be honest, there are some countries I've never heard of. We are a totally global company. We have over 5 million users in China, for example. And from the beginning, because we had to deal with so many complexities, Brazilian payment methods and different marketing methods across different European markets, that it has helped us tremendously to scale and go global.
Any comments on how it is to work with the European government and bureaucracy compared to what you've seen in other continents?
I don't feel there's more bureaucracy in Europe. like there are countries where it's difficult. Like we have an entity in Spain, and that's a pain. I agree.
A lot of visits to the notary.
Yeah.
We have
A lot of very stressful power of attorneys, to
Yeah,
make sure everything works. But we had we also we had an entity in Germany, and that was also a bit painful. Like Poland is similar, but I think it's like in the US it's just a different perspective of being painful. Like the amount of money that we need to spend on lawyers in the US is kind of compensating for that government issues that you deal with processes in Europe. So I think the system creates some pain points in every market, but it's hard to really say, oh, here's easier. Like it's very much different, but yeah, there are some interesting points about operating in every market and trying to understand from legal perspective what are the main problems to deal with.
And it also seems to a certain extent that the government, I think, gets more involved in the entire venture and startup space. For example, in Austria, most of the early stage startups receive quite a substantial loan or subsidy from the government. It's relatively easy to raise €1 million from the government, and you don't have to pay it back.
Have you ever seen how that evolves during the next rounds, how it's perceived?
It's not. Well,
Sorry, I'm asking.
Yeah, this has helped us. So
free money.
When we started the business, we were funded by the European Commission.
Yeah.
And that is great because you get money, you don't have to give up any equity.
Okay.
Exactly.
But it also helped us a lot to build the credibility to institutions. So we work for universities.
But I bet there is no free lunch, yeah?
There's free lunch.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you have to make a report on the end of the period.
Okay.
Okay. Right, but because what we are doing basically is something that the European Commission have tried themselves a couple of times to create a good platform to create transparency in education. They didn't really succeed, so they were really happy that we did do it with from the perspective of the students. So now that's helped us a lot.
And think about the enterprise investment scheme in the UK, which is
Yeah.
a tax incentive for business angels, where you can invest up to £100,000 every year, and you get 50% back from your income tax from last year. And if it goes bust, the government covers up to 70% of the investment, which is insane. I mean, again, in the US, those kind of incentives don't exist, and that's why in the UK, business angels have invested more than £1.3 billion on a yearly basis. And it's quite common if you have an above average earning that you would put some of your money into startups. So there is actually also a few good things that the government is doing in some of those markets.
Great. If you would have a magic wand, what would you change in Europe? We'll keep the languages for you. We'll keep the
No, don't change that.
Just for you.
We need different languages.
Anders, come on. You're from Denmark. What do
I'm
you
from
think?
Denmark. I think when I'm at a conference like this where there are so many sort of stakeholders from American institutions, one of the things that I wish I could change in Europe was that there was better sort of collaboration between institutions across borders. I think we have quite a lot of collaboration. I mean, and I know there are things that are working within the European Union, but I think at the sort of very sort of basic level, at least that's something we see from our clients within the university space. It's a very sort of geographically restricted to the UK, and I think there would be a huge opportunity in actually leveraging the fact that being European means something. I think that's one thing that I would like to see changed, and I think the US has a natural advantage there that people sort of feel an affinity to the country.
Good point. Any other magic wands?
I would change the attitude of younger people towards starting a business. I think it's still relatively conservative. Spain, as an example, they did a research a few years ago asking university graduates what would be their preferred job. And 70% said they would like to work for the government. I mean, who does this? Who wants to work for the government, right? I mean, it's insane. And that's simply because it was seen as a stable job and slow income, and basically you don't have to work much. And that was the attitude a few years ago. Now it's totally different. Now people start their business and want to achieve more. And I think European ambition, Europeans have to be more ambitious and want to build global great companies. That's what I would like to change.
There are a lot of investors here as well. And there are actually quite a number of non-European investors that are setting up shop in Europe. And I'm sure you guys also all get the phone calls from Asia and from the US. about investments. How would you look at Europe from the perspective of an EdTech investor? We already mentioned the market probably being more capital efficient, valuations probably lower. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things are true. I think the other thing that, is the case, and this is a huge strength of Europe, is just the quality of the talent is really excellent. And as Bernhard said, I mean, you're building a language business. You want to have someone speak, you can attract and hire people who speak 18 different languages. I mean, we have almost a 50-person team, and we have close to 20 different nationalities across our team. So, there is a dimension to the diversity of that sort of talent pool, which I do think is actually a huge advantage for the teams who are building those businesses. And also, I mean, it's interesting. I think what Bernhard was saying as well. I mean, we are certainly more capital efficient. We're forced to be more capital efficient. We raise less capital, but I think that is, that's sort of a very good set of ingredients for then learning how to really scale your unit economics. So I think for investors who, it makes sense to be investors who are not interested in businesses below a certain stage and size in Europe. It's just too risky, they're too far. But actually, if you're looking at, we're now, I think, coming into a heyday in Europe where you're starting to have a lot of companies who are genuinely seeing and achieving very meaningful scale. And I think how we have to operate in the earlier stages kind of forces that disciplined approach, which probably means that transition from startup to scale up is easier to make.
I mean, let's face it, EdTech is hard. And if running a startup is doing a marathon, then EdTech is doing an Ironman. It is just extremely hard. It takes long to scale up the business, and it's just more complicated than other verticals like gaming or other things that have been around for longer. And I think what you will find with European EdTech entrepreneurs, they have a lot of grit, to use the term that is spoken about so much here at this conference. Because if you've gone through the bureaucracy to found a company in Spain and deal with German labor laws, I can tell you that nothing will shock you anymore. And you will be just continuing with the business. And that's what I think makes the European EdTech founders a bit different.
Yeah, I like that.
Any other comments on Europe from an investor perspective?
I think that's like the type of investors that we attract are investors who have that clear statement that like huge companies can come no matter from what location. And I remember when we were raising our Series A, that was like 3 years ago, I tended to bring that capital efficiency to investors. And I always felt that the underlying message that they read was, oh, you're not moving fast enough. Like capital efficiency is an advantage that you can like salaries vary between countries. But I always had that feeling when I was talking about like our capital efficiency. It was kind of a justification to offer lower valuation, or to say, oh, like what would you do to move faster? Like how would you spend more money to deliver more value to investors?
And Anders, you're celebrating today because you just announced the fundraise, I think?
Yeah, I mean, that was from Europe. So we have angel investors from a bit all over the world, and then we have a group of European investors that have just invested $4 million today, which is great.
Congrats.
I think, to be honest, I think it comes back to this thing about sort of thinking global from the beginning, and it's, we've really tried to just build that into the DNA of the company. And I feel like we're repeating ourselves a lot now, but I think that's what the investors have seen as well, right? It's like it's a global team, global client base, global investors. Everything is just global. It's just we're based in Europe. That's it, and then we just move from there, basically.
So we have 1 minute left. So from the lens of an educator, what do you think educators can learn from Europe?
Educators outside of Europe, or
outside of Europe, what can they learn from Europe?
That education doesn't have to be expensive. Good education doesn't have to be expensive. I'm always shocked seeing the amount of money that is being spent, especially in the US, to get a degree. And I was at this MBA. Guess what? All the top students came from public universities that were basically for free. And there were people sitting in the room that paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the education. So education doesn't have to be expensive.
Any other?
That's a good point to end on.
Any other learning points? So how do you guys think, for instance, here we have more In Europe, you have a little bit more the goal, like everything needs to be good on average. I think the UK is a little bit in the middle. In America, you have more of a really competitive where you want to be number one, in particular in higher education, for instance, between institutions. Any comments on that?
I mean, I think from one of the things I think it is, I mean, this is slightly different from, Edwin, what you were saying, but I think one of the things that's very, very interesting to us about Europe, and it's sort of shaped the evolution of our product to be much more labor market and skills gap focused, is that in Europe, I mean, people are thinking about workforce alignment, employability, skills, apprenticeships, applying for like vocational degrees in a way that the US is only just now starting to have conversations about. So I do think as an educator, for all of us, it's really critical to think about how we're going to raise this generation of students to become employable and to take advantage of emerging opportunities. And I think in Europe, that's sort of more baked into the DNA of how we think and how we educate.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we got the last bit out of the session. We squeezed every little thing out. And please don't forget about Europe.